Okay, let's dive right in. Welcome to this completely covered explainer, where we're looking closely at a fascinating, highly influential, and definitely controversial text, Ivan Illich's Medical Nemesis. It is a multi-layered critique that seriously challenges how we view our own health and, more importantly, the systems we've built to protect it. We're starting with a pretty provocative question, which actually serves as the central premise of the author's entire argument, and that is modern medicine actually making us sicker? It's kind of a jarring thought, right? I mean, we're so conditioned to associate medical care with healing and living longer. But Illich challenges us to look at the unintended, systemic, negative consequences of our healthcare systems. And that brings us directly to our source text for this explainer, Medical Nemesis, which was published back in the mid-1970s. In this sweeping critique, Illich argues that the medical establishment itself has crossed a really dangerous threshold. Instead of simply healing people, he claims it has become a major threat to human health, literally expropriating our natural ability to care for ourselves. So let's look at exactly how he breaks this all down. To deliver a totally comprehensive summary, we're going to follow Illich's own framework. We'll start with the illusion of progress, then we'll break down the problem across three distinct levels: clinical, social, and cultural iatrogenesis. And finally, we'll wrap up with his ultimate solution, confronting medical nemesis. Section 1. The illusion of progress. So before we break down the harms of the medical system, Illich insists we have to first address a historical premise regarding how major diseases were actually conquered.
Just consider the timeline of a major historical killer like tuberculosis. In New York, back in 1812, the TB death rate was massive, estimated at over 700 per 10,000 people. But look closely at the timeline. By the time Koch actually isolated the bacillus in 1882, the rates had already dropped dramatically down to 370. When the very first sanatorium opened in 1910, the rate was down to 180. And by the time antibiotics finally became routine after World War II, it had slipped all the way down to 48. This brilliantly illustrates his point that the decline of these major historical epidemics happened way before specific medical interventions even existed.
And so, this data points to a massive public illusion: the widespread belief that doctors and medical progress alone cured historical epidemics. But the reality, according to the data he presents, is that environment, improved housing, and most importantly, better nutrition were the primary determinants of general health. He writes that there is no direct relationship between the progress of medicine and the mutation of sickness. He's effectively aiming to completely shatter the public illusion of medical supremacy.
With that historical context set up, we arrive at the anchor term for this entire text: iatrogenesis. It literally means doctor-made illness. Illich defines it as clinical conditions for which remedies, physicians, or hospitals are actually the pathogens, the sickening agents themselves. And he's not just talking about a random surgical mistake here. He divides iatrogenesis into three escalating levels of societal harm. Let's see how this builds, starting with the first level.
Section 2. Clinical iatrogenesis. This is the first level, and it focuses entirely on the direct, physical harms inflicted by the medical system on individual bodies.
Illich points out that while some treatments obviously work, many carry severe physical consequences. We're talking about doctor-inflicted injuries, dangerous drug combinations, completely unnecessary surgeries, and the massive rise of defensive medicine. That's where doctors perform tests and treatments not necessarily because the patient needs them, but simply to avoid malpractice suits. The text makes a staggering claim here, that the pain and dysfunction resulting from technical medical interventions rival the morbidity of traffic accidents and war-related activities. Section 3. Social iatrogenesis. Building on that physical harm, the text escalates to the second level. Here, the focus shifts away from the individual body and looks at how the medical system monopolizes our entire society.
Illich outlines how medicine undermines health through what he calls a radical monopoly. First, the medical monopoly forces people to become consumers of care, effectively sidelining traditional mutual care and self-medication. Second is the medicalization of the budget, where massive amounts of money are aggressively diverted away from other community needs and pumped directly into the medical system. And third is diagnostic imperialism. This is where medical bureaucrats subdivide people into categories, literally defining who's normal, who's sick, who can work, and who needs to be locked up. Medicine basically becomes a moral enterprise that dictates acceptable behavior by labeling everything as a medical condition.
To really ground this social impact, specifically that medicalization of the budget, in a staggering economic reality, the text highlights a 330% escalation in medical care costs in the United States over just a 20-year period. And you might wonder, where did all that money go? Well, Illich argues it wasn't primarily due to the greed of practicing doctors, but rather a massive increase in medical paper shufflers and incredibly expensive hospital administration. The system just grew massive, feeding on itself, all while life expectancy for adult males in the US actually began to decline during that exact same boom.
Section 4. Cultural iatrogenesis. Now we hit the third and what Illich considers the absolute deepest level of his critique. This is all about the philosophical and psychological loss of human resilience.
Cultural idiogenesis is the paralysis of healthy responses to suffering, impairment, and death. Illich argues that historically, cultures had mythologies, tight communities, and personal strength to cope with pain and the inevitability of death. But the modern medical establishment, by promising to engineer and manage all of our suffering, strips people of their autonomy. Society essentially loses the ability to independently cope, which effectively turns everyone into a perpetual patient, just waiting for a technical fix.
Now, notice how this taxonomy logically escalates. It's like a giant puzzle coming together. We move from the clinical level, which causes direct physical harm to individual bodies, up to the social level, which exerts societal control and drains budgets through institutions, all the way to the cultural level, resulting in the profound loss of coping ability and human resilience. This brilliantly illustrates Illich's main thesis, that an attempt to help has completely transformed into an over-engineered system of control.
To truly capture the weight of this argument, Illich writes, "The true miracle of modern medicine is diabolical. It consists in making not only individuals, but whole populations survive on inhumanly low levels of personal health." For Illich, just surviving, hooked up to machines, or being dependent on daily pharmaceuticals is not health. He's deeply concerned that we are just accepting a managed institutional maintenance of life rather than fighting for true, autonomous, vital human health. Section 5. Confronting Medical Nemesis. Finally, let's look at the ultimate conclusion of this critique and what the text actually proposes as the path to recovering our health.
Illich uses the classical Greek concept of nemesis. In mythology, nemesis was divine vengeance against mortals who showed hubris, people who try to act like gods. In this context, medical nemesis is the self-reinforcing loop of negative institutional feedback. It's basically nature's response to our hygienic hubris. He argues that the modern misery we face isn't just some engineering error that can be fixed with more medicine. No, it's the inescapable backlash of industrial progress trying to control nature entirely.
So how do we actually reverse this nemesis? Well, the text is explicitly clear. We absolutely cannot rely on more medical remedies or even consumer protection groups that just demand better medical products. Instead, the solution requires 3 steps. Number 1, the demedicalization of society, stepping back from the idea that every human condition needs a clinical label. 2, the recovery of the will to self-care among everyday people. And 3, setting strict legal and political limits on professional medical monopolies, essentially returning the power of health back to the individual and the community.
Ivan Illich's framework leaves us with a really profound challenge. Regardless of where you might stand politically or medically, his work forces us to step back and completely rethink our relationship with the medical establishment, and ultimately with our own bodies. He asks us to view health not as some commodity we purchase from a hospital, but as a personal virtue and a freedom that we absolutely must protect. So I'll leave you with this final thought to ponder from today's explainer. Are you ready to reclaim your autonomy over your own health?